I'm, of course, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And before I ask you any question, you get this one free shot where you can just tell everything you want to tell about yourself. Just very short, keep it under 1 minute, if possible. Who are you and why are you interesting?
Oh, no pressure. It's so funny. I heard this thing once somewhere, and I felt in a moment of imposter syndrome that actually does describe me. I'm not an interesting person. I just have an interesting job. It's something I used to say when I was an astronomer. So my name is Tana Joseph, and I have a PhD in high energy astrophysics from the University of Southampton. And yeah, I used to have a very, very interesting, cool job that took me all around the world. And now I have an interesting and different type of job where I work as part of the University of Cambridge's public engagement team. And I am in charge of public engagement for arts, social sciences, and humanities. So quite a big departure from my background that I studied in, and now I work with very different types of researchers, which is it's been really cool and fun, and seeing how they see the world has been quite an eye opener for me.
Okay, thank you so much for this little summary. My plan is now to go through your career basically step by step and look at all the very interesting parts, the parts where it's about getting money, getting jobs, getting fellowships. And actually, let's start right with that. You've been awarded 2 fellowships, I know of.
3, technically. I always forget, but my first postdoc was also a fellowship.
Okay. Yeah. So amazing, because I would be interested, like it was the ones I know of are the Fulbright and Royal Society fellowship. And I want to know, like, how did these fellowships shape your career? How did you get them in the first place? Is there anything that you would say really helped you? Either something you said in an interview or something that you did that led you to this point? And how did they provide opportunities for you in advancing your research?
So the fellowships they weren't explicitly planned on my part, but the thing I found that really helped me, I feel, in my application and feeling ready to apply for them is my network. I knew the people that worked in the institute, and I knew what work they did, and I had in some capacity worked with them or been, at conferences with them. So I really drew on my network for that, approaching potential hosts to say, I'm interested in applying for this, or do you think I would be able to work with you? Would you be willing to look over my application and so on? And in fact, my Fulbright was suggested to me by someone. This person was my PhD supervisor, and he still has a lot of interest in my career, even though it's not an academic career anymore. So somewhat of a mentor to me. And he was the one that suggested that I apply for the Fulbright Fellowship. And what I would say about the Fulbright is that one was a little bit more strategic in that the Fulbright Fellowship is very well known, but it's something, when you think Fulbright, you don't think science, right? You think law or something to do with policy.
Actually, for everybody in the room, could you summarize in like one sentence what the Fulbright Fellowship is?
So the Fulbright Fellowship is one of the United States Department of State's flagship actually cultural exchange programs where they use education as a vehicle for cultural exchange. So you can be a Fulbright scholar, which is usually at the PhD level. I was a Fulbright fellow, research fellow, so I was a postdoctoral fellow. And it's very prestigious. You get to go to functions at the US Embassy in your country and meet ambassadors and so on. So that's been really great. And it has a lot of brand recognition. And I'll come back to brand recognition a little bit as well later on. Remind me. And so the Fulbright, like I said, because it's so tied to cultural exchange and, policy and politics and stuff, those are the kind of subject matter areas that people think of when they think of Fulbright. They think, people who are going into law or maybe business, but or international studies, that kind of thing. They don't necessarily think of science, where when you say law society, we know that that's a science organization. And so that actually gives you an advantage because you are going up against more typical candidates, and then if they see astronomy, they're like, oh, we rarely get any physical science application. So that does make you stand out a little bit.
Okay, so I will take away from this, like really build a good network
Absolutely.
at every opportunity, and also look outside of the typical realms of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, I love that. Cool. Okay. Yeah, I think that is probably also the advice. Then that would be my next question. What advice would you give? That was perfectly included already in this. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the entrepreneur side of you. You founded AstroComms. Tell us, what is AstroComms and how do you use it to promote STEM communication and consulting?
So AstroComms is a company that I started when I was doing my last fellowship, which was the Royal Society Newton International Fellowship at the University of Manchester. And I was doing a lot of science communication already. And I attended, so the Royal Society fellows are very well supported in a lot of ways. And one of the ways they support you is you can do a lot of free training courses with the Royal Society. And one of them was for people who are thinking about going down a business avenue with their research. And so mine isn't directly tied to my research in a technical way, but I attended this training course, and it was kind of the last piece that I needed to put this puzzle together to think about how I could more formally do my science communication and outreach, but get paid. Because there is evidence to show, for instance, that women are expected to do more housekeeping tasks outside of their technical or actual paid job tasks in the workplace. And this is not just in academia, or not necessarily specifically academia, but also in corporate and so on. So, asked to do things like organize internal events or programs and things like that. And I had been doing a lot of that. I had done things like departmental open days, job work experience programs for school children, and all sorts of things like that. A lot of school talks, especially when I was younger, because there's also research to show that when you talk to an audience, you mustn't be too much removed from them in their career path, for instance. So speaking to high school kids, they want someone who is a student, someone that's just within reach in terms of aspiration. So I was doing this from quite early on in my career, and I was doing it more and more, getting more experience and getting better, but not getting paid. And so I wanted to kind of take control of my own pay equity. And so I started this consultancy where I ask for a fee to speak, and if people can't pay me, I say no. And then the company sort of changed in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, where a lot of people started paying attention to Black Lives Matter and equity and decolonization and anti-racism, especially in the science sector. And I then expanded the remit of AstroComms to include equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as decolonization work as well. And I was asked to give a talk at quite short notice at the European Astronomical Society conference in June of that year. And, people were scrambling because the world had changed. We were in lockdown. And so I was able to give this talk remotely, and that really, and it was about equity, diversity, and inclusion in the context of astronomy and science academia, and that really kickstarted that part of my company's journey, and that's been the fastest growing part of my work the past few years.
Oh, I really love this origin story that you took just something that really happened to you all the time. Oh, and now it's making money, but it's a big goal you're trying to achieve.
Yes.
Okay. If you let's shift the focus from this to Cambridge and compare what you would say is, you work here as a public engagement manager, is one of them, and your aim is to embed those EDI practices into the research culture. What would you say is just the biggest challenge at the moment?
The biggest challenge at the moment, I would say, is to get people to take public engagement a bit more seriously and think a bit more carefully about how public engagement can help broader society, but also help you perhaps as a researcher be better, clarify things in your mind, talking them through to different audiences or interacting with different audiences and hearing your feedback. Some of the most difficult questions I've ever been asked when I'm doing science communication was by a trio of 7-year-olds one day in a shopping mall in Manchester. And they asked, because children's minds are so free, they asked these complicated questions, and one of them was about one of them had heard about how the earth itself is cooling down, how it used to be a hot rock, and now it's cold enough that we can live on the outside of it, but they heard it's still hot inside. And does this also happen to other planets? And how long does it take to cool down? And then we had to stand there and think about secular cooling timescales for exoplanets, and come up with an answer for this child who had, thought was very nervous about, like, are other planets getting cold enough, fast enough that things can also live on them? And we never answered that question, and we looked like fools. And so thinking about these questions when they're asked by people who aren't in the same environment as you is so important to challenge yourself as a scientist. I would say as well that when we think about public engagement, people think about talking to school kids. And I just gave an example of talking to a school-age child, but it's so much more than that. And so another challenge I would say is to get researchers to realize that public engagement also could mean working with policymakers. It also could mean commercialization of your work. There's a lot of different types of things that potentially fall under public engagement or knowledge exchange, where you swap research methodologies and things that you've learned and so on with people and other research institutions. There's a lot of different ways that you can engage with the public. In our context as a university and as a researcher, it would mean anyone who's not doing the same research as you. So the public could also be someone else with a PhD, but their PhD is in archaeology. And so getting people to think differently about what public engagement is and how it can benefit, like I said, society, but also yourself, your research group, your institution, and see that there's a lot of space for mutual benefit in this. It's not just a one-way thing where you talk at people.
Okay, let's stay exactly on this. When it comes to us as PhD students, what would you say, apart from the typical outreach talk, is the most important public engagement that we could already do on our level, in our position of basically no real say in anything? But what is the most important public engagement we should do outside of outreach talks?
That's a very interesting question, and it really depends on what your research is. Okay. Some things are going to be easier to talk about and to other people, but it depends on what kind of impact you want to make. There might be, for instance, applications to environmental sustainability. A lot of what we do in astronomy is remote sensing, and that has real and very valuable applications to climate monitoring and climate impact mitigation and all that kind of stuff. So it depends on who you want to talk to, what your research is, what kind of impact you want to make. Talking to children at schools is also very fun. We need children to be able to see different people doing things in the world that they might not have heard of. But if you're going to the school, see if you can talk to the teachers or the head teacher. And see if you can make this talk at the school a regular thing that happens every year or twice a year. And not just, a one-off thing. See if you can do things strategically as well. That's really important. And it is at the student level, it is really difficult to make that argument to your supervisor where you're all ruled by funding timescales. I talk a lot about the work that I do in terms of, can you get this done on the timescale of a postdoc? Is a very careful consideration. But talking to, the higher ups who ultimately decide what you can and can't do, think about it with the game plan, think about it strategically, and talk to them about how this can further your research, and the research impact, which is, does your research have a benefit to wider society and the environment? And that's where the public engagement team at the specific university, Cambridge, can help you, because we have thought about all this stuff already. And if you come to us and say, we'd like to think more strategically about this, or do you think that we could sit down with some people in my institute and come up with a plan to do. We'd like to, we've developed this new thing, and we think policymakers should know about it before we go commercialization route. Could you put us in touch with certain people? That's a very important consideration. Think about what you want to do, how you can do it strategically, and know that the public engagement team here at Cambridge are always here to help you.
Oh, this is really nice. And would you say it's even possible to just come with like a small new method you developed and basically no idea how this could affect public engagement, go to the engagement team to like develop something together?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because if it's not something that we can directly help you with, we also work with the university's impact team. And the umbrella of impact covers public engagement, commercialization, also policy, knowledge exchange, of these things I've mentioned before, and they can then further direct you. But if you come to us, we're always willing to chat. We love talking to people. That's why we're in public engagement, and then we can direct you from there.
Okay. Okay, I love to hear this. That sounds like a super interesting opportunity. I will definitely chat with my supervisor about this. Okay, now I want to get like a little bit of a bigger picture about things and how they evolved. Your role has taken you across like various countries and institutions. And I want you to ask you, have you seen that the conversation around EDI and also decolonization and astronomy, we will talk about the decolonization part a little bit more in detail later, but did you see some sort of evolution in this, and have you recognized any regional differences?
That is a fantastic question. When I saw it, I was so excited because I do talk about this a lot as well in my work around the world. So there's definitely been a time evolution, and there's also very much a geographic context for how equity, diversity, and inclusion and decolonization is conceptualized, is accepted, or is talked about. And so the time evolution, I actually have a talk on this in the context of gender equity. The time evolution, for instance, was when I started my PhD 15 years ago, when I was a student, undergrad 20 years ago. The focus was heavily on gender, but the gender binary, so men and women. No LGBTQI+. In South Africa, the focus was race, because South Africa has a very specific and unique racial history. That's still, I say history, but still also our current conditions, and due to apartheid. So in South Africa, the focus was almost entirely on race, with gender as a separate and underlying issue. In Europe, it was entirely gender, but again, gender binary was the focus. It was women and girls in STEM, women and girls in STEM. And in the US, it's a combination of both, because they also have a very specific type of, a specific history of racialization there of minorities. And so, racialized minorities. And so their focus is, compared to Europe, a lot more race-based, but also there's a gender aspect, but again, the gender binary. So this is going back 20-15 years ago. Then things started to change, and then I will just say before I move forward with that, 15-20 years ago, the focus was, when we talked about women in STEM and girls in STEM, the idea was that the women needed to act more like the men. And I went to, in the first few months of my PhD, I went to a workshop day in London with several women from my department in Southampton, and down to London. People from all over England were there, and there was one man in a room full of women, and basically these kind of luncheons and talks were focused on getting women to be more confident, because we found, for instance, that men were more likely to get promotions than women. And there's a lot of this work is corporate, coming out of corporate or private sector. So the language I'm going to use sounds a bit corporate, but they were trying to put that onto academia, and you can already see that's not going to always be appropriate and very unlikely to work if you just copy it wholesale, but that's what state of the art was at the time. So an example was women get promoted less often or get pay rises less often. And then the thinking was vibes-based, what I call vibes-based deductions rather than evidence-based deductions, was that, it's because women are too shy to ask, we're too timid. So then we were being told to be more confident and you must speak up for yourself. And then a few years later, the research came out and said, no, women are asking at equal rates as men. We're just getting told no more often. So we were never the problem. So then that era of trying to make women be more like men, that kind of ended. Then it became about gender equity, but again, still the binary. And then a little bit of LGBTQI plus started to creep in. Europe's still very terrified of race because you know what you did. So that's very lacking behind in the USA, but it's the issue has been forced a lot more. And in South Africa, again, the context is very specific across Africa. The issue is also gender balance because the vast majority of South Africa, everyone in Africa is black. So the racial aspect of that is not considered because why must it be? Why it's not a thing. It's entirely on gender. And so we came through into this thing of, okay, maybe we need to start treating women better. And then LGBTQI stuff started to slowly come in. The UK then started to talk a little bit about race and class, because again, here's a geographic specific thing is the UK is very focused on socioeconomic class, that the US maybe not so much, in South Africa, not at all, across Europe, not so much. And now we're in the era of where race has been spoken about a little bit more in Europe, much more so in the UK than in the US. LGBTQI plus considerations are a big part of this across the world, not so much in Africa. And one big thing that's coming in now is the climate change, the climate justice aspect of it, and how that's wrapped up in EDI and colonization, and because it disproportionately affects people who are already marginalized in other ways. And so that's slowly starting to come into the conversation. So we're starting to take a slightly more holistic approach, and we're moving away from the gender binary a little bit with the inclusion of LGBTQI plus justice and issues that we're trying to raise as well. So it's come a long way. Things change at different paces in different places. But one thing I will also say is that these kind of conversations don't always take place in the same way in different countries. I worked in the Netherlands and did some work in Germany as well. And for instance, in Germany and in France, it is illegal to discuss race. Like if you have a survey or something, or like I did an exercise recently with a group of public engagement professionals where I asked them to fill in their different identities, like your nationality, your first language, your age, all the different things that make up who you are as a person. And one of them was race and one of them was ethnicity. And there was a French person there and they said they were so shocked because they've never been faced with this before, because it is illegal to do this in France. It is illegal to do this kind of thing in Germany. And lots of other countries as well. And so you can see immediately that then the legal framework that you're working in also dictates the kind of conversations that you can have in the workplace, or if you're trying to change culture, research culture, academia, or whatever, there's certain things you just can't legally touch. And that has a big impact on the kind of conversations that you can have.
I'm very sorry, I need to leave, but can I send you a reminder that when we finished, including Q&A, you can stop recording here?
Perfect, thanks. What would you say is the biggest thing that the UK would learn from other countries, and what would you like to have implemented into the conversation here in the UK? What would be your highest priority?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that the UK is, again, it's very local context dependent. I don't know if it's always a good idea to import things from other places. And in fact, one of the big barriers that you face in Europe when I first started trying to have these conversations around equity, diversity and inclusion and decolonization and talking about race specifically, is then Europeans would just say to you, no, but we're not racist. You're trying to import US problems into our country. And then I, as a Black person, am standing there going, are you being serious right now? Because obviously that's not true. You just haven't met a Black person to be racist too. It was always my response. In the US, African Americans make up more than 10% of the population. Here in the UK, 3%.
Yeah.
So it's easy to say you're not racist because you've probably never seen a Black person in real life. So I would say that, but the UK has a willingness to have this conversation much more again than other Western European countries. So it depends on if you know a lot about what's happening in the US, the UK seems very behind on certain things. But if you've worked in Western Europe or other parts of Europe, then suddenly the UK seems like a trailblazer in certain things. So it really depends on what specific issue you're trying to tackle. I think, as I said, the UK has a very specific fixation as well on socioeconomic class, which, as I said, is not a consideration so much in other places. So they're a leader. They consider things like there's a lot of talk around accent. The accent that you speak in as a British person as a class signifier, and the fight on the BBC, for instance, there's lots of people make jokes about how it's very rare to hear regional accents on the BBC. There's one monolithic British BBC accent that does not represent the vast majority of the UK, never mind England. And so even things down to your accent can be a point of contention, and that's a very specific British thing that's entirely valid to explore. So importing things from other places doesn't necessarily always work for the local context, and each country or region has to grapple with what is valid and important for them.
Okay, you were already now talking a little bit of colonization. Again, I want to know a little bit more. What do you mean with colonization in the context of astronomy directly? And what does decolonization in astronomy mean, and how can scientists work towards that goal?
So the sort of textbook definition of colonization is, people coming from outside a place, taking over resources, subjugating people, potentially erasing their cultural heritage, those kind of things. And astronomy ties directly into that, actually, because a lot of times astronomy institutions were started to directly further colonial projects. So the South African Astronomical Observatory, where I worked as a postdoc and an outreach officer, is the oldest research institute in South Africa. It's over 200 years old, and it was started because the British were in Cape Town, where I'm from originally, on the south coast or southwest coast of Africa. And they started this observatory because they needed better navigational capability for their ships, so that their ships could sail around Africa and sail around the world and colonizers and do colonization. So this research institution, this observatory, exists directly and specifically to further colonization. So it is part and parcel of a colonization practice. And it's not the only one in the world, it's just my very local examples in the city that I grew up in. And so another example is where we build astronomy research institutions, or astronomy observatories specifically. South Africa, I've already given an example. Another example in South Africa is the Square Kilometre Array, the world's biggest, not just astronomy project, the world's biggest science experiment. Sorry, Large Hadron Collider, you're going to be number 2 when SKA is done. Built on indigenous land in South Africa, unceded indigenous land in South Africa and Australia. So now SKA is part of a colonizing tendency on 2 different continents. All the astronomy observatories in Chile, unceded indigenous land of South American peoples. Hawaii, Mauna Kea, the famous example where there's been a lot of pushback that's gotten a lot of media attention, built on a sacred site for Native Hawaiians. So this pattern of behavior, this entrenched pattern of behavior that we have as astronomers to build on unceded indigenous land is entrenched. It is just part of how it's business as usual for us, and we don't seem to know how to get out of this. With the SKA, at least, there's been consultation with local people and indigenous people, because local non-indigenous people in the area were also displaced when we're building these things, and how to compensate for that, and how to acknowledge that, and how to move beyond acknowledgement, because now it's very trendy to have an acknowledgement statement, but what does that mean for the cultural heritage of people that is being displaced? You are still on their sacred land. So saying, thank you for letting us build here, here's some money. Is that an adequate compensation? And how do we make sure that these people and other local people, or whoever else in the surrounding communities, have a stake in what's happening, have a say that's actually listened to in a meaningful way, and are compensated, and how do they benefit from this? So coming back to what I said about research impact, what is the benefit for these people in wider society, who, in their local context, for you building the world's best whatever telescope in their backyard? Because with the radio telescope, for instance, around SKA, you can't use cell phones, no Wi-Fi. Did you know that you can't use a petrol engine car in the vicinity of these telescopes? Because radio telescopes will pick up the spark in a spark plug, gives off a flash of radio emission that can blow out the receivers. So you need to switch your car to a diesel engine. Are you paying these people to do all of this stuff? They can't use their microwaves. Are you making sure each microwave is in a Faraday cage? What are you doing to help these people whose lives you have upended? And that's just the normal local people. That's without, when you add the extra vulnerability of being in an indigenous group that has such a long history of subjugation and struggle and fighting against colonizers in their waves as they come over the centuries. Are we doing enough? And I would say no, to make sure that that our work is not damaging the environment. We're not those kind of doctors where, we say first do no harm. But maybe we should lend that ethos from medical doctors and say, maybe first do no harm should be the first thing we think about, because I'm talking about people, but there's also environmental impacts. There's, certain species that maybe only exist in these environments, and how are we displacing them, especially in the context of climate change? Are we furthering species extinction by building these installations? So this is all a consideration, part and parcel of decolonization. And there's a lot of things around how we teach astronomy. All the constellations, they are never the local names. They are always the ancient Greek and Roman names. They don't even look the same in the sky. Because I spend a lot of time in what I like to call potato Europe. I don't get to see the European night sky very often. I spend a lot of time in the UK and in the Netherlands, where it's often cloudy and raining. So when people ask me, oh, do you know this constellation? I'm like, no, because where I grew up, I've never seen this. I don't know what Cassiopeia looks like. You can't see that from the southern hemisphere. And also it's often cloudy. So I don't get that question as much as I feared. But the fact that we are teaching people the night sky from a European perspective is another classic example of colonization. Even the night sky itself, even though we talk in astronomy a lot about it's the cultural heritage of every living thing on this planet, whether it's people, whether it's moths who use the moon to navigate by, we are teaching people a colonized perspective of the heavens. So from the education part, from the observatories part, from where the research gets done, who gets to do the research, how it's funded, these are all considerations for if we want to have a decolonized astronomy global community.
This was a lot. I mean, I have to say, I feel like a little bit deceived, not by you, opposite, because when I think about the SKA, and how it's communicated, it always shows this huge, vast landscapes, not a soul around.
Oh yeah.
And I never even thought about that this might affect people who lived there, or that there were even people in the first place. So yeah, I just realized I have to do some research on my own. And I think we all have to think about science communication, and not even to the public, but just how we inside the community talk about this, because it's hard to address a problem you don't even know exists.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so just to kind of clarify, we'll give SKA some of its due. The SKA project in particular has worked a lot with local communities. They have paid for maths and science teachers at local high schools. They've made funding available for the children who, coming out of these improved high schools, go on to study at university. So there has been put back into the community, but it's a very new thing. That's not necessarily the kind of thing that happens everywhere. But it was very planned out in that way in South Africa. And another thing, just to add to the decolonization thing, is that astronomy is often the friendly face of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Because we know that there's a strong ties between our space-borne instruments and the military. A lot of these big contractors like Lockheed Martin gives ESA money, the European Space Agency. For instance, a lot of astronomy comes directly from military intervention. So the gamma ray astronomy is entirely, well, for the most part, it is space-based. You can do ground-based gamma ray astronomy. X-ray astronomy, you can't do from the ground ever. But gamma ray astronomy started because Russia and the US were spying on each other for nuclear testing. And then they kept seeing other things in space. And they're like, oh, we should give these scientists a little telescope so they can do that. Hubble, the story goes that Hubble is a donated military telescope. I think it's W first. It's also space-based telescope. There've been two telescopes gifted directly to NASA from the US military in the last 15 years, where it's not a secret. And one of them does fly. So we get military scraps. We work with military, contractors and all this kind of stuff. And everyone's like, oh, astronomy, it's like, studying the stars, but there's a big military industrial complex component behind that. So that's also something that we need to interrogate when we think about how we are going to decolonize our research area.
I have to say, I really like your attempt of saying, hey, let's implement the first to know how rule, even in science. Let's do this. Okay, I have to admit, we could spend like multiple hours talking about this, but we don't have that much time, so I need to shift the focus again a little
bit. Let's go for it.
Actually, let's talk about something very happy. As an EDI consultant, and you've worked with STEM organizations everywhere in the world. Could you share one success story where your consultancy actually significantly improved equity or inclusivity in the scientific community?
So I saw that question and I was like, oh, this one's going to be a bummer. Not because I don't think that I've had an impact, but because earlier on I mentioned vibes-based interventions versus evidence-based interventions. Yeah. What we're not so great at yet in public engagement, in science communication, in EDI work is collecting evidence of the impact of our work. Like, did this actually work? So I give a lot of talks. I do a lot of workshops and training and chatting to people and trying to help them put policies together or guidelines, codes of conduct. What we don't often have is evaluation of this work. So I actually can't answer that question. I don't know. I can only give you a vibes-based answer. People seem receptive. One thing I guess I did do was I was instrumental in implementing codes of conduct in a lot of activities, say in South Africa, just reminding people that a code of conduct needs to be in place. Like, hey, did you think about a code of conduct? What's the code of conduct for this event, this meeting for your organization? Can we use that in this place? And then remind people the code of conduct is something that you all agree to adhere to when you come here. And so, yes, there has been one time where I did stand up and say, just want to remind people that the code of conduct is in effect even after hours, because we are staying in a place like in a resort. And so because the accommodation is paid for by the institute, blah, blah, you're bound by this code of conduct. And that did lead to better behavior. People were more, I'd say, more mindful, professional behavior. Just reminding people something as simple as the code of conduct is still in effect.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit bad that you have to have a code of conduct so people behave properly, but it's very good that we have things like this implemented.
You don't know, you can't decide something is bad behavior if you haven't defined what good behavior is, for instance. Like, this is what we expect. We expect good behavior, and if you don't see good behavior, then you can say, okay, now things are out of bounds. So it's not about what you can't do, it's about expecting everyone to behave professionally and respectfully, and just reminding people of that.
Yeah, no, I can see how this could make a big difference. Okay, and now we're looking further in the future. So what future projects or goals are you most excited about, whether in your research, public engagement, EDI work, or even your new job? Maybe we could talk a bit about that.
Can't talk so much about the new job yet, but one thing I'm excited about that's coming up in 2 weeks from today is my Equity, Diversity and Inclusion for Public Engagement training course that I have put together and will be running as part of the University of Cambridge's Engaged Researcher Training Program. So we have over 20 training courses around public engagement that everyone who is affiliated with the university can attend. So everything from introduction to public engagement, to planning your public engagement, evaluating it, as well as the EDI course, and then there are lots of other things around promoting yourself on social media, or introduction to impact, policy making, all that kind of stuff. So this is the new one. The newest one is my course, and I'm very nervous around this, but I'm also very appreciative of the opportunity that I've been given. I only started this job in January, and I've so quickly been given this big responsibility, but also this opportunity to put my expertise to work for the university and for the public engagement strategic plan that we have. And so we'll be running this course starting in 2 weeks, and then we'll run at least once a term. And it's our first step towards embedding the equity, diversity, and inclusion principles and frameworks into public engagement. And then from there, we also work to embed public engagement into research culture. So this is our contribution to furthering that.
Okay. Very nice. We should definitely check out these courses, I think.
Yeah.
So, my last question is a very simple one. If people want to get in contact with you or get to know you better, know more about your project, what is the easiest way to find you?
The easiest way to find me used to be on Twitter, but now, X, and now it's not so great anymore. But all my socials have the same handle. So, at Tana Joseph. And then you can find me to talk about public engagement, all things public engagement, even though I'm not the public engagement manager for physical science and technology. That is my very capable colleague, Claudia Antolini. So you can talk to anyone in the team, but she's the specific person that you will be referred to. If you Google public engagement Cambridge, it will come up. And maybe you can, if there's some notes for this or something, you can put the link to the website, because I don't know it off the top of my head. But public engagement, Cambridge University, it'll come right up. There'll be links to how you can book sessions with us to chat to us one-on-one. When by us, I mean the public engagement managers, there's 4 of us. Or how you can book onto the courses, which are free of charge. And throughout the year, the more core courses, so introduction, planning, evaluation, my EDI course, and introduction to impact, the research impact, done at least once a term. So there's lots of opportunities to learn from us, come chat to us. We also provide funding with money you can apply for as well. And of course, I have to plug the Cambridge Festival, which is our flagship public engagement event that runs for 2 weeks just before Easter. And in fact, the last time I was here was during the last academic year's Cambridge Festival, where I came to this Institute of Astronomy, and you were running a family weekend event, and it was absolutely packed. It was so great to see so many families here, so many young people interested, and so I would love to see that continue.
Okay, and thank you so much. Are there questions from the audience?
No pressure. If not,
no pressure. If you don't want to, I can also stop the recording because we will have people watching this later. Just FYI.
I guess one of the things that I was curious to take more with the public engagement side. Do you think there are good things to be doing to train yourself in that, or what's the best practice that we can be getting now?
So I will reiterate, come to our training courses. We have, and that the idea around this is to empower researchers to be able to do the best public engagement that they can do, and to also reimagine public engagement, because a lot of people think, I'm not of the opinion that everyone should do public engagement, but everyone should be able to support and facilitate public engagement in their own way. Not everyone feels comfortable doing it, but it's also to let people know that if you are worried about public speaking, there are so many different things that you can do that don't involve you standing up on a stage in front of hundreds of people.
Yeah.
We run courses on social media and personal branding, how to start a podcast, how to make videos, how to animate your research. So, creative writing, poetry. We run an event called Creative Encounters, that we are busy revamping at the moment. But that was a great opportunity for researchers to read some of their own personal poetry that they've written around their research. So there's lots of different ways that you can do public engagement, and it's not necessarily speaking to, like I said, speaking to school kids. It's also, how to talk to policymakers, how to talk to, we call it specific audiences. So working with museums, working with patients if you're in the clinical sector. You can make it as niche or as wide as you want. We do bespoke trainings as well. So get in touch with the public engagement team, have a look around and see what training might be interesting to you and what you might be interested in. And there'll be something. There's over 20 courses, and there's 22 courses right now, including my course. There's another course coming later on in the year as well. So we're always growing our offering. And in fact, if you have any suggestions for courses you would like to see, if there's something that you, for instance, we work a lot, I say I'm including myself now, even though I'm not in active research anymore, we work a lot with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger ethics issue, not even just the research issue. Is that something that we should be addressing in a public engagement training course? How to do, what does public engagement look like now in the age of generative AI? Is that something that we should be offering, especially to scientists?
Any more questions?
I don't really have a question, but I was just wondering, I'm from New Zealand, and there's like a lot of indigenous astronomy, like with Māori people there. I was wondering if you've ever done like any work in New Zealand in terms of like what you're saying, like decolonization and that sort of thing.
Not specifically New Zealand, but when we talk about indigenous astronomy, New Zealand and Australia are definitely a part of that, because of course the history there goes back so far. So they're always the go-to when people talk about it's the Aboriginal Australians, South Pacific Islanders, Maori, and of course the Mayans, because they're calendars. Those are always what people think about then. Indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous knowledge systems is something that I'm trying to work into my decolonization practice more. At the moment, I'm specifically focusing on just astronomy as we practice it now and how to change that. But a big part of that is how do we acknowledge, recognize, and value and incorporate indigenous ways of knowing into what we currently teach. And an example of this, not an astronomy example, but an example I saw recently, and I absolutely loved it. We know that the global climate patterns are currently experiencing El Nino. We're in the middle of a very strong El Nino phenomenon, and it's which is El Nino is obviously literally the boy or the Christ child in Spanish, because the phenomenon is related to sea temperatures, and we explain it in a very technical way. Like when the water heats up in certain parts of the world, that means that there's going to be more powerful cycles of like storms or drought or things like that amplifies normal weather and climate patterns. And I saw a newspaper article or online article about it recently where they mentioned El Nino, and they said it was first discovered and recognized by South American fishermen. Because a lot of the times the scientific stuff is it's discovered by white people. The first person to climb Mount Everest was and they don't mention the Sherpa, who's is it Cezanne, who was the first person actually up there. And so when they acknowledging that, South American fishermen knew that when they felt the water at certain times of year around Christmas, that's why it's called the Christ Child, because it's usually around December time, around Christmas time. So they're like, oh, okay, it's around Christmas time, the water, we know the environment so well that we can feel the slight heating of the waters. And when that happens at this time of year, we know that we are going to be in for a shift in our weather pattern. So drought is coming, or floods are coming, or storms will be of increased power, or more storms or something. So this is ancient knowledge that's been passed on generation by generation by just some fishermen, but they are so embedded in their local, in their local context. And they depend on the ocean for their livelihood and for the survival of themselves and their families and their community, etc. And so kind of just acknowledging that El Nino is this thing that's so well studied, and we use, satellites now to observe it, but the people who first understood the connection, understood the change in environment, and understood the connection to wider patterns were South American fishermen. And so that's the kind of small changes that we make when we say, did this group of people actually discover this thing, or were there people living there for millennia that knew about this already, but no one bothered to ask them, or their ideas were just simply stolen? So it's that kind of thing. Like, how do we build in that acknowledgement for things that that have been known but haven't been given the right attributions?
Okay, really good. Is this also in the direction of the rebranding you mentioned earlier?
Oh, there's the branding.
Yeah.
Oh, the brand recognition. No, that's around kind of career stuff.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. That's around career stuff. And I was talking about the brand recognition of the Fulbright and the brand recognition of Cambridge. And I think that's something that people know, especially if you're coming from, it's so interesting, locally in the Cambridge area, let's say, the University of Cambridge doesn't necessarily have good connotations to it, but if you're outside, like internationally, I don't know if you also experience this coming from New Zealand, but when I said I was coming to work here, people were so excited because this place is such a strong brand recognition. As well, the Fulbright did as well, the society does in the UK context as well. And how to be aware of that and how to leverage it, but also how to let it not be, especially in the public engagement scenario, your reputation precedes you when you have Cambridge attached to your name, and how to let that be something that you can leverage in a positive way, but don't let it be something that leads you to hubris.
Yeah. Okay, I think those were wonderful finalizing words. We have to stop now because our hour here is over. And I'll stop the recording.
So quickly, that was so fast,
right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. And super informative. Also, later we will have a dinner.
Yeah.
At 6:30, which is free for all students. So if you want to join a dinner, which doesn't cost, in the restaurant Paka, you would have to tell me quite soon because I will book in 2 minutes. So if you have nothing to do at 6:30,
so where's the restaurant? What's it called?
Paka, and it's like maybe 10-minute walk from here.
So how do you spell that?
PAKKA.
On Castle Street.
Castle Street.
Castle Street.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right around my accommodation.
Are you Eddie's?
I am Lucy Cavendish.
Ah,
so Castle Court.
Exactly the other.
Yeah.
Okay. Then a little show of hands. Who would like to go there?
I won't be able to make it, but it'd be nice.
Oh, that's
Have
fine. So then I will write.
Laundry can wait.
Yeah, you must never say no to free food. That's the only thing that I think that I will retain from my 20 years in being a student and being a researcher is the way that I'm still drawn to free food. Almost it's embarrassing. I'm 40 years old. I have a full-time job, but you can lure me to the back of a window this way. And that's something that I learned in the
one
time of
thing
being
you
a
learn.
student.
Yeah.
I